We're at war with Russia now. NATO is already at war with Russia. The way to respond to the way Russia has been attacking in Europe, whether it's drone flights into Poland, or overflights, or cyber attacks, or assassinations, or espionage, is to be strong. We need to be 100% able to defend ourselves, Europe only, with what we've got. And in the longer term, Europe needs to be demonstrating as an alliance within NATO that it can take over and build the strategic enablers, the capabilities with which currently America underpins the alliance. I think flattering President Trump merely invites contempt. Bullies, when flattered, will just feel even greater contempt. Bullies have got to be stood up to. No. But I think the message must be a clear, we value the long-term relationship with America, but be in no doubt we are ready to, or we will start building things up ourselves. I think this is Russia lashing out, having been humiliated and being humiliated by Ukraine.
Let's start from the latest attack on Ukraine. Over 75 cruise missiles, Zircons, all kinds of really powerful weapons that Russia used against Ukraine yesterday. What do you make of this intensified attacks on Ukraine from Russia? Do you think Russia is escalating after seeing what Ukraine is doing inside Russia?
I think this is Russia lashing out, having been humiliated and being humiliated by Ukraine. We all saw the graphic scenes of oil terminals blowing up on the edge of Moscow, the lids of these great oil storage tanks hurling through the air like flying saucers. We're seeing the strangulation of Crimea and the extraordinary success the Ukrainians are achieving in interdicting logistic routes into Crimea. This is Russia lashing out, and this is Russia doing what Russia does best, which is to try to target and terrorize the civilian population, thinking that it will change the dynamic and somehow make Ukraine come more malleable towards Russian intent. But of course, all it is doing is making the Ukrainians even more determined not to give in.
How would you describe that pressure that you just talked about, be it on Crimea, be it on the Russian energy sector? How is Ukraine doing in that regard?
Well, the intent is clear: 40 days and 40 nights. Biblical almost, and I think that's deliberately chosen by President Zelensky to send the message. It's founded, I think, on the extraordinary scale and pace of innovation that Ukraine has achieved in recent months and years. They've had to do it themselves because their allies were not prepared to give them the long-range precision strike capabilities, so they designed them themselves. Their flamingos and other capabilities striking deep into the heart of Russia. And it's a well-designed, the ways of this strategy are well-designed. So you've got the long-range strikes hitting at oil refinery and oil production facilities, arguably reducing the ability for Russia to export oil, striking at the Crimea, as we were discussing earlier, the strangulation of Crimea. And I've always felt that Crimea is Russia's center of gravity, source of strength, in a sense. It occupies a really important place in the Russian psyche. The fact that Putin's glory, in inverted commas, was, in a sense, founded or established when he retook Crimea in 2014. And we can all remember the scenes of jubilation in Red Square when that happened. So for Putin to be really embarrassed in Crimea is deeply wounding to him. And we've seen that huge queues, trying to get out, a state of emergency there. That's an admission it's a real admission of defeat. And then, of course, the interdiction of logistic supply chains into Crimea from the north, from Melitopol, around the Sea of Azov, the bridges over Crimea being interdicted, And this all demonstrates that, that the emperor's got no clothes, because clearly the Ukrainians have taken down Russian air defense to such an extent that they can pick off Russian capability at will. It's all, of course, designed to force Russia to accept that they've got to talk to Ukraine, and they will be talking to Ukraine from a position of weakness, and gives Ukraine the upper hand in any talks. But I think, we shouldn't take it all for granted. I think we've got to be very measured about this, and I keep saying that, one swallow doesn't necessarily make a summer here. Now, this is more than one swallow, and the summer is well on its way, and Ukraine is doing well. But as your listeners will understand better than anybody, never underestimate Russia. Russia has extraordinary depths of ingenuity, scientific capability, and an ability to respond. And all warfare is about action and counteraction. And we should expect the Russians to be coming back in a much more sophisticated way than they did last night, for example.
What would that way be?
Well, I think it is I would highlight the scale of innovation. They've got to think about innovation. What we haven't talked about is this, where the Russian so-called spring offensive has failed completely. The casualties, the killing of Russians, or seriously wounding of Russians, is on a massive, massive scale. I think something like 40,000 last month. When you're talking about 1,300 a day killed or seriously wounded. And I think Russia, by all appearances, appears to have, it's coming to a crunch point. Does Russia escalate? Does it completely remodel the way it is pulling in manpower? Because the problem Russia faces now is that it cannot replace the manpower being killed and seriously wounded. They're in deficit. So how do they change that? They go for conscription. And if you go for conscription, if Putin goes for conscription, this is really taking the war into the Russian metropolitan areas, the Russian middle classes. I should add, of course, that the war is already hitting, because one of the products or the consequences of the striking against oil-producing and exporting facilities, particularly oil-producing, is that Russia is running out of petrol. 50 out of the 80 Russian regions have got petrol rationing. Fuel ration cards are being issued. And this is humiliating for an energy superpower. They're having to turn to Kazakhstan for support. And maybe 5 years ago, Kazakhstan would have immediately said, yes, of course, we'll help. Kazakhstan is hedging about it because they can see that Russia is no longer what Russia was.
So two messages that I took from that response: that Ukraine has an upper hand now, or advantage, and is setting itself up for a better position at the negotiating table, and that Russia can overcome that disadvantage that it has now. So how would you think that can be addressed? What needs to be done for Ukraine to continue on this path, to stay on that good side of the negotiating table?
I think this is absolutely, and this is particularly relevant the week with next week's NATO summit. We're getting too close to the end state, the last chance saloon here for the alliance. But what is fundamentally missing is a clear strategy from the NATO alliance that says that long-term peace and security in Europe is dependent on understanding the reality that Russia will never give up its intent to take over Ukraine. Russia cannot be the country it believes it should be without Ukraine as an integral part. And therefore, NATO needs to think strategically about how Europe can be whole, free and secure against the long-term threat from Russia. And to me, the first objective in such a strategy has got to be supporting Ukraine achieve defeat in Russia, supporting Ukraine to achieve Russian defeat in Ukraine. And that is what is fundamentally needed. It needs a strategy that is bought into by all the allies, and the components of such a strategy are advice and support on the military line of operation, you might call it. Not necessarily. We can't teach the Ukrainians anything when it comes to tactics and how to fight Russians. They in fact, they should be teaching us and need to teach us. But we can help them with advice on higher formation command, organization, training, manpower, although they're doing great stuff by themselves. It requires a financial and economic lines of operation as well, because fundamentally the allies need to find ways to take down the Russian economy. The fact is that Europe The European Union is still buying large amounts of Russian hydrocarbons. Even last August, the European Union bought 1 billion euros worth of Russian hydrocarbons. That's got to change. And then I think also that cognitive line of operation, that cognitive warfare that seeks to find ways to drill into the Russian mind and the Russian support, because this is supported by Russia. I think the most important thing is to find ways to undermine Putin by demonstrating to the hardliners in Russia what a failure has been and how low he has brought Russia down, to foment that sort of discontent. I think there's little point in trying to identify some olive branch bearing liberal waiting in the wings to take over from Putin. That is for the cuckoos, frankly, because they've all been killed, Navalny and others, or they're in exile. But I think the way to do this is to foment discontent with the mill bloggers, the extreme nationalists, those who believe Putin hasn't gone far enough, and get them discontented with Putin.
There's much conversation about conscription and Putin calling the full-scale mobilization in Russia. If that were to happen, what do you think, how would you rate the threat to NATO, in addition, obviously, to Ukraine, but do you think that means something for NATO if we see that mobilization?
Yes, definitely. And I think it comes under the heading, and I didn't really touch on it earlier, you either force, Putin accepts he's got to talk, or he escalates. And the full-scale mobilization would be part of that escalation. And there could be other parts of that escalation as well. And NATO's got, and this is a real threat, an existential threat to NATO. If I were Putin, what would I do? I would seek to divide and rule in NATO, to sow confusion in NATO. What might that involve? Maybe biting off a bit of the Baltic states, a bit of to force NATO to defend itself, or to force NATO to make decisions about Article 5. Maybe Spitsbergen, take over Spitsbergen in the Arctic. What would NATO do then? Would NATO really go to war for the sake of an island of a few polar bears and some Norwegian and Russian civilians? Big question marks for NATO. But NATO needs to be wargaming all these contingencies and be ready to demonstrate unerring strength and determination and a willingness to defend itself. Also, there is the final option, which we mustn't forget, which is the nuclear option. I think that's unlikely, but I think NATO needs to be making it 100% clear to Putin that any consideration of a nuclear option the consequences would be the complete destruction of any Russian capability in Ukraine by NATO air, because it would mean hands off, the gloves are off, it's war with Russia, no ifs, no buts.
With the U.S.-NATO relations at the current moment, do you see some of that happening? Where do you place NATO's unity right now, given what's happening from the U.S. side related to the troop, relocation, withdrawal, overall very tense relations, even bilateral relations?
I think that's a really important question, and I think we have to see the world as we find it, not as we'd like to find it. And what do I see? I see might is right. I see a US president describing the global rules-based order as bullshit, quote unquote, and then the US national security strategy describing that global rules-based order as a cloud castle illusion. I see a US president who earlier this year in January threatened to attack the territory of a NATO ally, Greenland, Denmark, which is obviously part of Denmark. So I think we have to take that as we find it. I hear what Hegseth says, I hear what Vance says. And we heard this right at the very start of the Trump regime back in January, February 2025 at the Munich Security Conference and the Brussels Defense Ministerials. So I think we have to assume that trust in the American president, whatever president was in the White House, that certainty that whatever president was in the White House would come to the aid of a NATO member if attacked has gone. And that Europe has got to stand on its own, with Canada, of course. And therefore now, and this is very timely given the NATO summit coming up, I think the alliance has got to say very clearly and unequivocally, we want to maintain links with America. We absolutely value the long-term relationship with America. But meanwhile, you, America, have made it very clear that Europe has to look after Europe's conventional defense. Right, we are going to do that. And we are going to put in place plans now for a short term, the next immediate short term, should Russia try and escalate to divert attention from where things are going in Ukraine. We need to be 100% able to defend ourselves, Europe only, with what we've got. And in the longer term, Europe needs to be demonstrating as an alliance within NATO that it can take over and build the strategic enablers, the capabilities with which currently America underpins the alliance. Now, that is a big ask. It's going to require massive sacrifice, defense spending, innovative ways of financing, etc., etc. But it's got to happen. And I think that's the way, actually, long-term, to build and maintain the relationship with America as well. What is not going to help us is if next week in NATO, Secretary General Rutte clings on to nurse for fear of something worse. In other words, hangs on to Trump's coattails, flatters him, tries to stay inside, to keep close to him. I think that's for the birds. It's now time for NATO to man up and say, yep, we'll do it.
Well, can those two things be done at the same time, flattering President Trump as well as strengthening NATO?
I think flattering President Trump merely invites contempt. Bullies, when flattered, will just feel even greater contempt. Bullies have got to be stood up to. No. But I think the message must be a clear, we value the long-term relationship with America, but be in no doubt we are ready to, or we will start building things up ourselves. The other point here is that this also requires cooperation with America, because this requires a drawdown plan, a coordinated drawdown and build-up plan under which America draws down as America builds up capability. What you don't want is to fall off a cliff.
Let's talk about the Sky Shield for a little bit. Do you think that, and this is a concept, that NATO can protect parts of Ukrainian skies to shoot down any potential projectiles that are flying towards NATO? Do you think that's a realistic idea, and do you think it's implementable? And do you anticipate that at the summit in Turkey, NATO will discuss this issue?
I think it's eminently doable. It's absolutely absolutely what NATO should be doing, and I think it's a great failure of NATO that it hasn't done it yet. It would send a very strong signal of NATO strength. It would send a very strong signal of NATO commitment to Ukraine. And I think it is absolutely doable. And people will say, well, it's going to escalate, it's going to lead to war with Russia. We're at war with Russia now. NATO is already at war with Russia. The way to respond to the way Russia has been attacking in Europe, whether it's drone flights into Poland, or overflights, or cyber attacks, or assassinations, or espionage, is to be strong. I don't need to tell the listenership and the countries your people are listening in that Russia respects strength and backs off when it's faced with it. If it sees weakness, it just invites Russia to double down and be more aggressive. So yes, it is a must.
And the final point about, as we're talking about NATO, where do you see Ukraine's membership in NATO? Is it something that we should see in the coming years?
Coming back to that articulation of what you might call a strategic goal, which I said earlier, a Europe whole, free and secure against a Russia that will never give up its intent to remove Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state. That goal has got to include Ukraine as a member of NATO. And as part of that goal, that is NATO building a deterrent capability from the Baltic to the Black Sea, to stand up against Russia. And I would also extend it further than that. I would say that strategy has got to include Georgia and Moldova as well.
Do you have any comments on how you see Georgia? Yes, Georgia should be a member of NATO, but with this trajectory, how realistic do you think that is?
Well, I think at the moment it's a trajectory that's not heading in the direction we'd like it to. And of course, this is classic of, I talked about the extent Russia is at war with us. This is a covert war against Europe, against NATO, and absolutely it involves electoral manipulation of the sort that arguably resulted in the sort of government that is in place in Georgia today. The same electoral manipulation that we saw in Moldova, Romania as well. No, I think absolutely that we must continue to keep our eyes on the direct destination and find strategies, design strategies, which will allow Georgians to do what the majority of Georgians want for their country.
You just watched an interview with General Sir Richard Shirreff. If you like our interview, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media wherever you are on social media. Thanks for watching and see you next time.